You are listening to Setting History Straight with Linda Watson on Hebrew Nation Radio.
And welcome to our program. And we have Mark Wally with us. Mark is going to be on with us today, and we hope to cover, is there another promised land? So, Mark, we need to ask the question, is there an end-time promised land here? And what we want to ask ourselves, is there any proof? Is there any proof, any biblical proof that America is being talked about as this promised land? You know, everyone, Mark, knows that the land in the Israel, which was the land of Canaan that the Israelites went into, and from their Exodus, they went into the land of Canaan. That was called the promised land.
Very much so. Very much so.
So, but did the Father have a plan for a second promised land? And that's what we want to cover. You remember that the Israelites were moved out of that land because of their sins. You know, 721 BC, they went into captivity, Israel did, from Assyria. And then 585 BC, Judah fell also.
That's right.
And we want to actually talk about, does the Bible actually mention or even allude to another promised land? That's what we want to cover today. So, Mark, can we start in 2 Samuel, and I think it's chapter 7, if I'm not mistaken? Yes, and so in that final promised land, we know that it is representing the millennium, but I think there's a forerunner for that, and that's what we want to talk about. You know, interesting that when you look at those 11 books of the prophets, it's the Father is writing, actually, it's almost like a legal document. And he's saying that I really loved Israel and how much he loved Israel. And he compares her to his wife and how she was an adulterous wife and she left him and went and worshiped other gods. And he's actually building a case, and he tells people in Ezekiel how she has broke his heart, just like someone who has lost their wife because their wife has been unfaithful. And this is the whole story that's being played out here. The whole thing is right, almost like a love story that he's writing, and he's talking about and comparing how much he loves this woman, Israel. How much more could I have done for her, he says. What else could I have done for her? In Isaiah 5, right?
Yep.
I think this thing plays out at the end time also, that there is another promised land. And I think we can easily see that, Mark. I mean, let's go ahead and start. And we'll start in 2 Samuel 7. And I want to start in verse 8. And it says, now therefore so shall thou say to my servant David. Now he's talking to Nathan, who is the prophet. You look in the early part of this verse. And David said unto the Lord of hosts, I took thee from a sheepcote, then following the sheep, to be the ruler over my house of Israel. Okay, so Father is talking to David, and he's saying, you know, you were just a little fella in the field, and I took you out and made you the ruler over Israel. And so the Father, you see, he does that all the time, does he not? Remember the story of Joseph? Joseph is in prison, and Joseph's taken out, and what happens? He becomes the ruler over Egypt.
That's right. That's right.
So the Father can do unbelievable miracles in our lives. We just don't realize that, and I think he's trying to show us, you know, even with Amos. Amos said, you know, I'm just a sheep herder. I'm a gardener. I have a sycamore, figs. And he's really telling people, I'm not a Levite. I'm not somebody who comes over as a prophet. The Father sent me to do this job. And so,
yes, that's right.
It's very interesting because the Father will sometimes start at the very bottom. You'll see that. He'll pull people from the very bottom all through history, not from the big, huge churches, but sometimes just a little person who's faithful.
What did God say about Israel whenever he chose Israel? And he told them that he was choosing them not because they were the greatest among the nations, but that they were the least among the nations.
And they were to do a job, which they never did.
They will do that job. They will do that job.
Yes.
2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 10. Moreover, I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them, that they may dwell in a place of their own, and move no more. Neither shall the children of wickedness afflict them any more, as beforetime. And as since the time that I commanded judges to be over my people Israel, and have caused thee to rest from all your enemies, also Yahweh tells you that he will make you a house. And when the days be fulfilled, and they shall sleep with your fathers, I will set up my seed after you, which shall proceed out of your bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever.
Now, there's a lot of symbolism in here that he's talking about. Building a house is in reference to building a temple, yes, but he's actually talking about building the seed of Israel, because he promised he would never, as long as there was stars in the sky and moon in the sky, there would never be a time that Israel was not alive and well on this earth.
That's right. Cease to be a nation.
She would never cease to be a nation. Man, we should be looking at these verses. What was Abraham promised? Abraham was promised to be the father of many nations, not just one nation in the Middle East. And everybody reads these verses and denies the promise of the father. He had a house that he built. That was the descendants of Israel. That's the house that he built. But when you get to verse 10, he's telling them that I will appoint a place for my people Israel. What in the world is he talking about? Because they had already been in the land for 400 years.
That's right. Must be talking about something in the future.
I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them there, and they shall dwell in a place of their own and move no more. Now, if you understand that the migration of Israel, because we're told in Isaiah 49 that she would go north first, and then she would move west. And she continued to move west until she got to America. When she got to America, she no longer could move. There was no other place to move to.
That's right. No more land to go to.
This is talking, I'm telling you, about America. You know, Israel was given these unbelievable blessings under Solomon and under David and under many of the kings of Israel. But in this day and time, there has never been a nation as blessed as America is. And how in the world could we see the blessings in this nation and deny our heritage?
Absolutely.
And say that we are not Israel.
Yes, ma'am. When you talk about a house, when he says right here in this passage that he's going to build a house, and when you look at the word house and you think about what it's in reference to, he takes a wife as to build his house, raise children, to raise the offspring from that, to build a name, many ways that you look at that. And when you look at America and you look at what's happening here, what is the main number one institution that's being attacked? And it's the family. It is the house. It is that structure of a husband and a wife raising children. And you just see those things being torn apart.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, you know, this is what the Father had in mind all along. It was not just a one-time event to have a promised land in the land of Israel, which that was a promised land. Nobody's denying that that was a promised land. When you get to Genesis 48 and it starts talking about the blessing that he put on Ephraim and Manasseh, and he's crossed the hands and he said, Ephraim, you're going to be a multitude of nations, meaning many different nationalities and people are going to come in you. That's what it means. This is a melting pot in this country. So that's one of the meanings of that verse. She's the United States, is she not? She was a multitude of governments.
50 nation states. I mean, each individual nation has its own boundary, has its own government set up, has its own president in the governor of every state, if you will, all united federally.
Yes, and she was to receive these incredible blessings. Well, who else in history has received such blessings as this nation?
Nobody.
This is not the important issue. The important issue is not that she's blessed. No, this means you have a job to do. And that job is to show light to the rest of the nations. That was supposed to be your job, which you have not done now. That's the whole point of this discussion. It's not about who's greater and who gets the greater blessing and who is Israel. It's about the job that was supposed to be done by you because you were under covenant. So
absolutely.
So this is what we're going back to here, and what we want to ask ourselves, is there any proof? Is there any proof, any biblical proof that America is being talked about as this promised land? And that's what we want to cover. So we're going to start with Isaiah 14, because we can't miss Isaiah 14. That is a critical chapter that talks about, I believe, America. Let's go back to Isaiah 14, and we're starting at the very beginning. In Isaiah 14, verse 1, and the Lord will have mercy on Jacob and will yet choose Israel. And he set them in their own land. Okay, I'm making the case that that land that he set them in is America. Now watch the rest of this verse. And the strangers, which are foreigners, shall join with them, and they shall cleave to the house of Jacob. So there's some foreigners that come into the land. Now let's see who they are. And the people shall take them and bring them to their place. So they're going to take these strangers and they're going to bring them to their homes. And the house of Israel will possess them in the land of the Lord for servants and handmaids. Now, when did that happen in history?
The time of slavery.
It was during the time of slavery. They took the slaves and they brought them in as handmaids and servants, which is exactly what's being described here. And they shall take them captives, whose captains they were, and they shall rule over their oppressors. So they oppress the people. We all know the story. And that at some point in history, that's going to turn around, and the people who have been oppressed will become the oppressors. Now,
that's right.
Is that not pointing straight to the fact that we had a civil war in this country, that we brought slaves into this country, and that's pointing directly to the fact that we were this place that he calls the place that he chose for Jacob. Verse 3, and it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord will give thee rest from thy sorrow. That is the slaves. That was the civil war. They were given rest from their hard bondage. It's talked about in verse 3, that thou shalt take up this proverb against the king of Babylon and say, how has the oppressor ceased? In other words, the people in the land now who are the descendants of the slaves, they're saying, we're still under slavery. Our oppression hasn't ceased. And in many cases, that's true, because they have not prospered financially. Many of them have not prospered financially. That is absolutely a fact. So this goes right back to our early history. See, people don't realize that the Bible is a living book. You know, you could see the entire play out of the Civil War here.
Yes, for sure. You know, the case that we're making in this about America being Israel, in the prophecies about Ephraim and Manasseh, the older and the younger, okay? The younger son being given the birthright, what does the birthright represent? What is Ephraim's job to do? Primarily, it is to function as the safeguard of the other brothers, of the other members of the family. This is given to you. Generally, in our family system as it is now, that would be given to the oldest child, right?
Right.
I mean, that's how it works. It just naturally goes that way, that the oldest child, because of their being older and being more mature as they're growing, surely if things work the way they're supposed to, then that child is going to mature faster than the rest of them. So in their responsibility, their leadership, that because of where they're born, they're just thrown into it. So, but Ephraim being the youngest, as Yahweh says, that this is the one that I choose. Okay? You know, Reuben, my firstborn, but he doesn't get the birthright because of flaws in his character, right?
Yes.
So then it eventually goes all the way down to Joseph, and then from Joseph down to Ephraim. So what is Ephraim's job and everything? And Ephraim's job is to bring those tribes back together, to bring Israel back together to completeness in the end, as we see that. And, you know, in the passage about the two sticks coming back together, you know, there again, you know, I've said before that those sticks came back together, you know, in the founding of this nation, when all 13 of those tribes are back together in those 13 original colonies, all at one time. And where did those 13 tribes come from? Where did these 13 colonies come from? With the research that you've done, and you know this, that each one of them came from a different tribe of Israel, as you saw laid out in the original promised land. And then they came here to this new promised land. And all of them are back together again, as they came from all of the Israelite nations that we see throughout Europe, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So, in thinking about that, the prophecy that was given about the two sticks coming together and that they're not going to be broken apart again. And we see that talking about the Civil War where, Ephraim and Judah wanted to break apart again. We're going to divide. But Yahweh said no. He didn't allow that to happen. They tried, but they were not allowed to break that nation apart again. And yes, that division is still there. You see that division.
But physically, they're still together.
That's right. Physically, they're still together. And in that same prophecy that he says, that Ephraim and Judah are eventually going to get along. They're eventually going to come together, and they're not going to fight against each other anymore. That hasn't been fulfilled yet, because we're still fighting against one another in the sense of the North and the South. You still see it in our nation. You see it in our politics, in the government, how things function. And that division of, want to look at it that way, Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and liberals. That's a better way of putting it right there. So that you see that. And when you look at the prophecies that were given about Israel, that Israel would never cease to be a nation before Yahweh. They would always be a nation. Maybe not under the name of Israel, but they would always be a nation, like you said earlier, until the sun doesn't come up and the moon doesn't shine, that if you can break the ordinances that God set in place, then Israel would stop being a nation. But those haven't been broken, and Israel is still a nation, and they will always be. And those prophecies in Scripture, when you see that, you can't just throw it away because you don't understand it and say, oh, well, hey, Israel doesn't exist anymore, or want to put them back in the Middle East in that little strip of land over there. And it just doesn't work. It doesn't fit.
Because remember, they were to spread as the sands to the sea. So that's just a very great analogy. So with that in mind, let's go to Zechariah 1 and 2, because I think she is talking about America in those first two chapters of Zechariah. Now, I'm going to pick up in chapter 2, and it starts talking about this line. It says that a man with a measuring line in his hand. Then he said, and this goes right back to Jerusalem being mentioned, being measured out in the book of Revelations. It's the same thing. Now, then say I, where goest thou? And he said unto me, to measure Jerusalem, to see what is the breadth thereof and what is the length thereof. And behold, the angel talked to me and went forward. Another angel went out to meet him. And he said unto me, run and speak to the young man and say, Jerusalem shall be inhabited as towns without walls for a multitude of men and cattle therein. So this is a different Jerusalem than the one in the Middle East. This one has towns in it. And it's telling you specifically it's inhabited as towns without walls. Now, when I read that, I went back and I done research, Mark. I did this. And I found that there were cities all over Europe and in Britain and even in Canada that have walls around it. Quebec City in Canada has a wall around it. York in England has a wall around it. Carcassonne is a city in France that has a wall around it. Croatia has a wall around it. Toronto, Spain, has a wall around it. There's many, many cities, even in Holland, even in Germany, that have walls around them. So he's not referencing those for Israel. In other words, those places, he's not talking about them representing this end-time Jerusalem. What this end-time Jerusalem is the actual second promised land. That's what it's really referencing here, because we know that there's many nations of Israel, and they're all the Christian nations. Even if you look at Galatians 3, verse 29, it says, if your Christ is you are Abraham's seed. So that means all the Christian nations are considered Israel. Bottom line, whether you prove it through history or the only other explanation is Galatians 3:29. It just spells it out for you. So if you understand that all these nations are Israelite nations, but this one he's only centering in on one nation that has no walls. And guess what country that is? It has no walls.
United
That's
States of
America.
America. That's
Now,
right.
Australia and New Zealand do not have walls either, but it says this country has a large multitude of people and cattle. Well, Australia and New Zealand have small populations, 25 million for Australia, 4 million for New Zealand. See, it has to fit all three criteria. And this is the only nation that he's talking about here. He's talking about a second Jerusalem. No matter how you look at this, that's what it's pointing to. Could this be a Jerusalem in the future? Yes, it could be also, except there's a prophecy written around it for the end time. So, Mark,
Yes.
can you pick up on the next part of this in verse 6 and 7?
Ho, ho, come forth and flee from the land of the north, says Yahweh, for I have spread you abroad as the four winds of heaven, says Yahweh. Deliver yourself, O Zion, that dwells with the daughter of Babylon. For thus says Yahweh of hosts, for the sake of honor has he sent me unto the nations which spoiled you. For he that touches you touches the apple of his eye.
No, he's specifically talking about this Jerusalem is the apple of his eye, but he's not referring to the land. He's referring to Israel, his people.
That's right, Israel, his people.
It does not reference land, whether it's in the Middle East or if it's in America. He is referencing the people are the apple of his eye.
Yeah.
And Ephraim was to be the firstborn, meaning, to put, just like you mentioned earlier, she's got to pull these nations together and bring them back to the covenant that was made at Mount Sinai. She's got to bring them back to that point.
That's right. Right. All right. In verse 4, it says, and I said to him, run, speak to this young man, saying, Jerusalem shall be inhabited as towns without walls. All right. When we talk about it speaking of something in the future, United States of America represents Jerusalem, playing the part of that. And as it stands right now, if this is for the future, meaning ahead of where we are now, then something's got to happen here that's going to bring God's people to a point of repentance, which was what Ephraim is supposed to do, is like you said, you mentioned, bringing them back to the covenant of God, the covenant of his Torah, of his government that he is going to put in place for us. He gave it to us throughout history, has shown us that by our own means, by the own things that we do, basically we shoot ourselves in the foot continually with it, but that he's going to bring us back to that covenant. You know, it's interesting, Linda. You know, all of my life and the people who have been raised in the church, one of the main verses that's quoted in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, you read, it says, for unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order it and establish it with judgment and justice. In my eyes, the biggest problem with churchianity today, if you will, is the fact that they don't realize that everything in Scripture is about a government. It's not about religion. It's not about a separation that the government's one thing and religion is another. Everything that Yahweh has told Israel and what they were supposed to do and how they were supposed to act was a government.
That's why these three horses are governments
that we're supposed to live under. So how can we look at Scripture and see anything different in the things that he's talking about when he talks about heads and horns and hills and mountains, all of these different things that represent power and authority and government, the ruling status, the ruling class of these things. And he goes on to say that he's going to be a fire around them.
Chapter 2, verse 5.
Yeah, he says, for I, says Yahweh, will be unto her a wall of fire round about her, and will be honorable in the midst of her. So this time frame when Israel, Ephraim and Judah together are going to come to the understanding and the knowledge of who Yahweh is, and the fact that He is the one that created them. He is the one that has been the protector of them and the one who has brought prosperity to them. You know, you look all through the book of Deuteronomy, and you see these things in there, in Deuteronomy chapter 32 especially, where he talks about them becoming fat, turning away from him. And this, look at our nation today, how prosperous our nation has been, and in the founding of our nation, when all we could do was trust him because we had nothing. And we could see the fact that his hand was upon this nation, and he brought them through the things he brought them to. But as time goes on, you see that we have prospered, we have built houses, we have filled our bellies, and we have forgotten our God. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 10 through 17 right there. And it speaks of remembering that when you come into the land and you reap the blessings of the land, do not forget to return thanks to Yahweh. And that is the very thing our nation has done. They have turned away from it, as it was in the parable that Yeshua told in Luke chapter 12 about the rich fool. What did he say? I have done all this. I have gathered all this harvest. I have increased all this wealth. I have no place to put it. I'm going to tear down my barns, and I'm going to build bigger ones, and I'm going to store these things up so that I can sit back and eat, drink, and be merry, and just, enjoy the fruit of my hands. And what does the Spirit say? That this very day your life will be required of you because you were not rich towards God. Understanding where these things come from. Our nation has gone to a nation that believes that everything that's good in this nation came from our politicians, came from our government, came from the work of our own hands. God didn't have anything to do with this. God's just something we do on Sunday.
Exactly. So now, with that in mind, what you've just mentioned here, and the fact that this is pointing to America, I want to show one verse, and I think it's a critical verse, and that is the verse that's in Ezekiel 38. Now, Ezekiel 38 is picking up on this same story in Zechariah, where it says, ho, ho, they come out of the north. And it says, deliver yourself. Don't just stay in Zion. Zion's a reference for Israel. It said, deliver yourself out of Zion. Deliver yourself out of the land of Babylon, because it's comparing this land to Babylon. So if you're looking at Ezekiel 38, the first 6 verses, it's telling you that these are Gentile kings. It says Gog, Magog, and it lists all of them. It lists Iran as Persia. It lists many nations here, Ethiopia, Libya. These are all Gentile nations. It's talking about these nations. Now, let's look in verse 11, because this is really interesting. In Ezekiel 38, verse 11, and thou shalt say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. This is what Zechariah 2 is talking about here. This army out of the north, which is the northern hemisphere, by the way, comes into the areas that he's calling the unwalled villages. And I will go to them that are at rest, which they've already talked about at rest. That means that they are apathetic and spiritually asleep, that dwell safely. They don't have a war going on. All of them dwelling without walls, having neither bars nor gates. He's telling you that it is America that this war is coming for, because that is the only nation that has no walls and no gates. That is an Israelite Christian nation. That it's pointing back to America here, and it's telling you that he's listing the nations that are going to come against you. Gog, Magog, all the others. Many of those are Middle Eastern countries, but some of them really are referencing, and we know that, China and Russia.
Yes.
Because it actually tells you here that they come out of the northern part or the northern quarter. Well, the northern part and the northern quarter is the top of China.
That's right.
So we can't be asleep on this. We need to understand that there's a war coming for America, and that war is going to be in the unwalled cities. The Father is using unwalled cities to specify, so you know who this war is coming against. And so
That's right.
he says, which one of those nations am I coming against? It's going to be us.
That's right. And this verse right here is in prophetic terms. There's no way you can look at that verse and not see the nation of the USA. There's no way.
So absolutely, and basically showing you here what is going to transpire. But we don't read the Bible in terms of what it actually says for the time that we live, because we, in our mindset, doesn't think it could ever apply to us.
Yeah, I mean, we've been taught from, our pastors that everything in the Old Testament has already happened and it's all done, and the only thing we need to focus on is the New Testament.
So, Mark, we're out of time. We need to close, and we need to say blessings to all. Mark, thank you so much for coming on with us, and we're going to say close now, and we're going to say blessings to all and good night.
For more information about this